Disappointment of northern Kuki land people over BSF and CRPF deployment inside Kuki territory. Disclaimer. The following article reflects the perspective and grievances of the Kuki community regarding the deployment of BSF and CRPF forces within Kuki territory. It is written with the intention of understanding the community's concerns during these times of distress. The article does not intend to harm or defame any individual or group, but to present the views from the Kuki perspective. The views expressed here are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any political, ethnic, or governmental body. At introduction, the recent deployment of Border Security Forces, BSF, and Central Reserve Police Force, CRPF, in areas of northern Kuki territorial boundaries has sparked widespread dissatisfaction among the Kuki people. These security forces, which are believed to be directly controlled by the Métis state authorities, are causing much concern among the Kuki population. There are a number of deep-rooted reasons for the Kuki community's feelings of disappointment and resentment, including the history of mistrust between the Kuki people and the Métis authorities, incidents of violence, and the perceived failure of the Indian government to protect the Kuki population during moments of dire need. In this article, we will explore these issues in detail and understand why the presence of BSF and CRPF in Kuki territories rather than buffer zones is deeply problematic for the Kuki people. Furthermore, we will argue that a separate administration for the Kuki people is the only solution to ensure long-lasting peace and security. 1. The control of security forces by Métis authorities. A major source of frustration for the Kuki people lies in the direct control of the BSF and CRPF forces by the Métis state authorities. The Kuki people harbor a strong animosity towards the Métis-controlled security forces, as they have consistently seen them as biased and aligned with the Métis community's interests. And this mistrust has been exacerbated by the ongoing conflict and the actions taken by the Métis government, particularly in the aftermath of the violence that erupted in May 2023. For the Kuki people, the idea that security forces within their own territory are being managed by the Métis government is a constant reminder of their vulnerability and oppression. The Métis state's control over these forces means that the Kuki community feels as though their security is not in the hands of impartial, neutral authorities, but in those of an adversary that has historically oppressed them. The deployment of security forces in Kuki regions rather than buffer zones, which could offer a degree of separation, only reinforces the perception of an occupying force. 2. The betrayal of the Kuki community by the Métis governments. The root of the Kuki's resentment towards the Métis authorities is the events of May 3rd, 2023, which marked a turning point in the relationship between the two communities. Prior to this date, many Kuki people had hoped that the state security forces would act swiftly to de-escalate the rising tensions in the region. They expected that the authorities would deploy forces to vulnerable areas, securing Kuki villages and preventing violence. The hope was that the situation would stabilize within a day or two, bringing an end to the hostilities and restoring peace. However, this hope was shattered when the Métis government failed to act decisively. Instead of taking measures to protect the Kuki population, the government allowed mobs to roam free, attacking Kuki settlements across the state. The failure to deploy adequate security forces to safeguard Kuki lives led to the destruction of over 200 Kuki villages. Homes were burned, lives were shattered, and families were displaced. The Kuki people were left to fend for themselves while their homes were destroyed, which caused an irreparable fracture in their trust towards the Métis government. This sense of betrayal, where the state authorities failed to protect their own citizens, has only fueled the Kuki community's hatred and distrust of the Métis government. The Kuki people feel that the Indian state, through its Meitei-controlled forces, turned a blind eye to their suffering and allowed them to become the targets of violence and destruction. 3. The Saibol incident and brutal treatment of Kuki women. The brutality faced by Kuki women in recent months has further exacerbated the community's anger. One of the most harrowing incidents took place in the Saibol area, where security forces allegedly under the direction of the Meitei authorities used excessive force against unarmed Kuki women. Instead of exercising restraint, security powder sprays sticks and logs to force Kuki women to retreat. Violence resulted in nearly 100 injuries, with 2 women sustaining serious injuries, one of whom was left with severe damage to her eye, likely caused by a gunshot or smoke grenade. The use of such extreme measures against peaceful civilians, especially women, has left the Kuki community feeling deeply vulnerable and violated. The women, who were merely standing up for their rights, were subjected to violent repression by forces that are supposed to protect them. The severity of the injuries and the cruelty of the attack have left an indelible mark on the Kuki people, reinforcing their belief that the security forces under Meitei control are not neutral protectors, but active participants in the oppression of the Kuki community. 4. Fear of vulnerability due to the deployment of security forces. Another key issue for the Kuki people is the deployment of security forces inside Kuki territories, rather than in buffer zones or neutral areas. The Kuki community is deeply concerned that the presence of these security forces within their villages makes them more vulnerable to attacks by the Meitei police and commandos. The forces, which are seen as extensions of the Meitei administration, are perceived by many in the Kuki community as directly linked to the institutions responsible for their displacement and suffering. Instead of providing a sense of security, the deployment of BSF and CRPF forces inside Kuki areas is viewed as a threat to the very livelihood of the Kuki people. They fear that these forces, which are seen as aligned with their adversaries, will not only fail to protect them, but may actively contribute to their oppression. So lots of bad stuff going on inside of these Kuki communes, and then inside of Kuki areas, because the road, the highways, can you imagine protecting yourself making police forces inside of Kuki communes? The communists own hundreds of thousands of kare. The Kuki people have made it clear that they do not want the presence of Meitei-controlled forces within their territories, as it heightens their sense of danger and helplessness. Their call for security forces to be stationed in buffer zones reflects a desire for impartiality and protection, not further exposure to violence and harassment. The initial trust in Indian and state security forces. At the onset of the conflict, the Kuki people had placed their trust in the Indian Army and state security forces. They believed that these forces, as representatives of the Indian state, would act impartially and work to safeguard all communities in the region, including the Kuki population. In the early stages, the Kuki people hoped that the Indian government would prioritize peace and security, preventing violence and loss of life. However, the events that unfolded in the aftermath of May 3rd, 2023, led to a deep sense of betrayal. The Kuki people watched as many of their villages were uprooted, their homes burned, and their loved ones killed or injured. The failure of the Indian and state security forces to intervene effectively in a timely manner, and their inability to stop the violence, has left the Kuki community feeling abandoned. What was once wholehearted trust has been replaced with bitterness and distrust. The Kuki people now view the forces that were supposed to protect them as complicit in their suffering, leading to a breakdown in the relationship between the Kuki community and the Indian state. 6. Separate administration, the only solution for long-lasting peace. The ongoing disappointment and frustration of the Kuki people have led to a growing consensus that the only solution for long-lasting peace in the region is the establishment of a separate administration for the Kuki people. The Kuki community has consistently emphasized their need for autonomy, as they believe that their security and well-being can only be guaranteed if they have control over their own governance. Given the history of mistrust between the Kuki people and the Métis authorities, as well as the failure of the Indian government to protect the Kuki population, many Kuki leaders now see a separate administration as the only viable solution, which is a more near-Western style form of democracy, which is fabulous. And there's so many great stories about this. Some of not being great at all. This would not only provide the Kuki people with greater control over their political and economic affairs, but would also ensure that they are able to protect their identity, culture, and way of life without the interference or oppression of the Métis state authorities. A separate administration would also allow the Kuki people to ensure their own security, free from the perceived bias of Métis-controlled security forces. By having their own administration, the Kuki people could work towards rebuilding their communities, restoring their livelihoods, and securing a future of peace and stability for the coming generations. The Kuki people, I guess, are not official. This step would go a long way in restoring the Kuki people's faith in the Indian state, as it would show a genuine commitment to addressing their concerns and aspirations. Conclusion: the disappointment of the Kuki people regarding the deployment of BSF and CRPF forces in northern Kuki land is rooted in deep-seated grievances that span over months of violence, broken promises, and the perceived failure of the Métis government and Indian security forces to protect the Kuki population. So, from the initial hope that state security forces would intervene to prevent violence, to the brutal treatment of Kuki women and the failure to act decisively in the face of attacks, the Kuki people have been left feeling vulnerable, betrayed, and without recourse. The deployment of these security forces under Métis control in Kuki areas has only exacerbated the community's fears and reinforced their sense of alienation from the Indian state. What the Kuki people seek is not more military presence in their communities, but a commitment to impartiality, security, and justice. Until these concerns are addressed, the Kuki people's trust in the Indian state and its security forces remains deeply fractured. The establishment of a separate administration for the Kuki people remains the only way to ensure long-lasting peace, security, and self-determination for the community. For more articles and in-depth analyses of the situation in northern Kuki land, subscribe to Zalangam Media. Stay informed and engaged with the ongoing developments that shape the future of the Kuki people.